Okay, everybody, we're starting tonight's talk. It's still daytime in much of the world, especially where our speaker is calling us from. I believe it's in Texas. But wherever you are in the Western Hemisphere, good day to you. Wherever you are in the Eastern Hemisphere, good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. I see there are some people who are up in the countries as far as Singapore, where it's well after midnight. I'm happy that some of my students from Yale and from Boston College are here as well tonight. So I'm happy to see familiar faces as well as all of you. All of you are welcome. Please remember to type your names as well as your affiliation when you are asking questions so that I can relay the information to Dr. Nada. Tonight we have a sold out event. We have over 240 confirmations. The only event that came this close is, I think, Her Excellency Noor Al-Kaabi, the Minister of Culture of the UAE. So it's quite a sold out event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Suhaila Taqesh, who is the curator of the Barjeel Art Foundation. And Suhaila will be introducing our speaker. And this is a custom of the Majlis where I ask someone else to introduce our speaker. So I hope to continue this going forward. Suhaila, the floor is yours and you may introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sultan, and thank you also for continuing to host these events and bringing the community together every week. I could not be more excited to be introducing today's speaker, Nada Shabout. Nada, as many of you know, is not only an expert on modern Arab art, but also through her efforts in writing, teaching, speaking, documenting, organizing people. I think she has helped the field as such to make big strides, both in the museum world and in academia, and in many ways sort of putting modern Arab art on the map, so to speak. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that probably virtually everyone in the field has in some ways been impacted by Nada's work. Her list of accomplishments is far too extensive for me to do justice in the time that we have, so I'll just give you the tip of the iceberg. In 2007, Nada published this book called Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetics, and it was really the first effort of its kind to take this historical and theoretical approach to the subject, and has really laid the foundations for the work of many future researchers. More recently, Nada co-edited this volume of primary documents from the Arab world that was released by MoMA in 2018 and has sort of like become a Bible in the field. Nada is a professor of art history at the University of North Texas, where she also leads the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Cultural Studies Initiative. She is the co-founder and president of AMCA, the Association of Modern and Contemporary Art from the Arab world, Iran and Turkey. For those of you who are unfamiliar with their work, do check it out online and consider becoming a member. Nada also leads a project called the Modern Art Iraq Archive, which is a website that I've spent a lot of time on, and it's really an effort to document Iraq's modern artistic heritage, including helping to locate the whereabouts of lost works after 2003, I apologize. And it's just an incredible collection of material online. You have images, catalogs, journals. It's a real treasure trove. Nada, welcome. We are so excited to hear you speak today.
Thank you so much, Suhaila, for your generous introduction. But also thank you really, Sultan, for continuing this Cultural Majlis online. I think it is even more needed now than ever, and I'm always happy to participate in any of your initiatives. Equally, we can talk about, you know, how Sultan has been impacting the field recently. So, and I am so honored to have that many participants in the Zoom. I was sort of scrolling through the names, seeing a lot of, you know, old friends and former students, and hopefully new friends that I can do and, you know, have in the future. Okay, so I think I was just thinking earlier that, you know, the good morning, good evening may not work anymore because of where we are in the world. So we need some other form of greetings. So Assalamu alaikum seems to be a very appropriate one. Okay, I now will share my presentation, which, to be honest, is going, oh, but then, you know what, Sultan, you need to enable my sharing. Once you took
Sorry.
over.
We did that. Go ahead. يلا تفضلي.
Okay, thank you. What I am planning to talk about today in the format of the topic of, hold on one second, can't walk and chew gum at the same time, I guess. Where is, oh, here you go. All right. And can't have my notes. All right. So what I am, sorry, I'm going too fast. The topic of today, writing art history, archiving, and the Arab world, is pretty much like Sohaila actually sort of charted, is the story of my career, and it's the story of the field of modern Arab art, particularly. It's kind of, and you know, as I was thinking this morning of how to really make this topic accessible and talk about, highlight, you know, the issue of archiving specifically, I came across a posting on Facebook just now by Sultan, which had a really interesting quote from the archival material from Sudan. I had it actually extracted, but now I can't see it because I can, you know, only do one thing, I guess, on the screen. But it talked about how archives tell a story, at least bits of a story. And this is how this whole thing started. Initially, as I sort of, you know, started graduate school and decided to move from the world of architecture, where I started, to the world of art history, I realized that the history that I was taught in the US and the UK of art and architecture did not include any places outside of, let's say, a history of architecture is focused on Italy, Rome and Florence. And then, you know, if we talk to them on the modern, then we're moving to Paris. And then the history of art, you know, it's sort of a very Western Euro-American focus. But as someone who grew up seeing objects of art in Iraq, in Baghdad, in my parents' house and friends' house, I have a wealth of visual images in my head, never knew how to locate them, never knew really what influenced my vision of color. I wanted to know more about it. And so to try to figure out as a student what program to go into meant that I needed to convince art history in the United States academia that modern Arab art is a topic, because, you know, initially I was told you either go Islamic art or you go Middle Eastern studies. There's no such thing as modern Arab art. I'm talking, of course, you know, this is early 1990s, so it's the last century. And some of you may have not even been born by then. But so I had to fight. The challenge was convincing art history department that I want to study modernism in the Arab world in an art history program, and that this is not Islamic art. But then also, once I managed to accomplish that, is then with the lack of having any sort of advisors who would guide me through, where do I find resources and what methodologies do I follow? This kind of continued as through, you know, my graduate work into graduating and then teaching. How do I teach the topic? How do I teach my students? Where are the resources? And again, what are the methodologies? It's a story that sort of, you know, continued, but then really got exasperated with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, as someone who is originally from Iraq and wanting to study the visual art of Iraq, I had no access to it during the 1990s because of sanctions. And then, you know, in 2003, when I was able to go, and I did go to Baghdad in June 2003, I saw the level of destruction to the point that, you know, specifically following the sanctions, that the story of modernism of visual production in Iraq was lost by then. Even this, and what you're seeing is Markaz Saddam Lil Funun, which is now the National Museum of Modern Art in Iraq, was bombed, and or there was a fire, and there was a sort of mega looting, and the archives disappeared from the museum as well. As it was, the archives were really not exactly that much useful, because there were lists of works of art with names of artists and titles that may or may not even really correspond to the work, and no images. But it was a list for us to know what was in the museum, and you know, what we can try to figure out. So my efforts of documenting this lost history, because then it became an issue of not only archives, but erasure of heritage, cultural heritage, destruction, and erasure of collective memory. Excuse me, it's allergy season in Texas, and it's kind of morning for me. So the destruction meant that there was an urgency. I mean, there was initially an urgency so we can write the story, but now there's an urgency because the story is disappearing. The object of the story is disappearing. This is around the time when, particularly late first decade of the 21st century and early second decade, where archives became really popular. They were objects of arts, but they also sort of started becoming documents of use. I think there was an archive craze. I was so often asked, what do you think of archives, or what do you do with archives? And as an art historian, of course, archives to me are only documents that tell something else. In themselves, they are voices of the past, and then the interpretation is really what we do with archives. But we also realize the problem, because of the rarity of archives in the Arab world and inaccessibility, that however graduate students particularly and young scholars were kind of hoarding their archives. They did not want to share archives because, you know, this almost, it felt like a, you know, a sabaq suhafi, you know, so some sort of journalistic story that didn't come out of it. So the, you know, multiplied by then, you know, that the problematic of the writing of art history, where we actually do need the archives for the writing. In a way, all of this kind of, you know, motivated and directed the many projects that Suhaila talked about. And in fact, this is what I'm going to do. This sort of, you know, all connected stories of archiving and writing and documenting and then mapping are all kind of connected, and they all sort of form this idea of what is a field, which, as Suhaila said, was non-existent, to be honest, when I started my journey. Luckily, we've changed. So I'm showing you some images of the works that have been in the museum, were in the museum, and were lost for now. And you can see works from 1920s, work from 1930s, the idea that, you know, this particularly modernism, because, you know, after 2003, everyone spoke of the ancient heritage, the humanities heritage, Mesopotamia's heritage of, you know, its heritage of the whole world, but no one really cared about modernism. In fact, every time I gave a talk about the Museum of Modern Art, someone would say, I think they have made a mistake in the invitation, because, you know, clearly you're going to be talking about the ancient museum. And they would be surprised when I say, well, actually, no, I'm going to talk about the Museum of Modern Art. And guess what? Yes, you know, Iraq is a country that is alive, it's contemporary. And so of course they have contemporary artists, as well as they had modernism. But because we have the stigma of the connection of modernism in the Arab world with national identity, it has become a political an ideological issue for many people. Like, what do you do with the heritage of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in Iraq under the rule of the Ba'ath and Saddam? Is it tainted? You know, do we want to look at it or not? When a museum was called Markaz Saddam lil Funun, it already has that stigma with it. So you're seeing images of some of the works that I have in my journey in 2003, saw in a room with no electricity and no environment control at the Hiwar Gallery, which is, you know, the result of effort of Iraqi artists going around and trying to collect what they can, because you would see images like this, where there are loads of these works of modern art on trucks. And someone offered me two trucks load of work if I had $5,000 in cash to give him. In Baghdad in June 2003 was an impossibility. And so, you know, the problem, of course, the crime is then when you have works like this one, the Faiq Hassan, Kurds of the 1950s, that shows up on the black market, but you can't even help Interpol to intercept because the government has not issued a list of what has been stolen, or, you know, the control over it. So then you know, inevitably just lose track of even where these works have gone. At the beginning, a lot of people would send me images and tell me that, you know, they have seen these works in New York, in London, other places, and these are examples of works that, for example, showed up in Amman in Jordan. And as you can see at the back, it's kind of a sort of really sloppy attempt to hide the seal of Markaz Saddam, which is one of the ways we can, you know, in the absence of an archive and any other sort of government documentation, there are very few things that we can use to guide us through it. So this is a problem that never stopped and continues, and that led me to start the Modern Art Iraq Archive to document the lost collection from the museum, but then slowly grew into something else. Actually, it was and this is why I love my students, and I never, or, you know, all those young scholars I mentor and I never let you go, is Salim Bahlouli, for example, who was just starting his PhD at Stanford, came to me and said, what if we also include digital text? If we go around, try to digitize text, which of course was a great idea. And we did that. And that sort of kind of, you know, led us to the Modern Art Iraq Archive, where you can sort of go surf through either some of the images, and it's a long story that I don't have time to tell you how I found some of those images, but, you know, and it's contested continuously, and so that's why I protect myself legally and say probably from the lost collection, but also there was, you know, all kinds of other documentations that we are able to upload. This site continues to be a project in progress, lacking funding at the moment, but, you know, what was great about this is that people sort of contacted me and said, we have this material, and started sort of, you know, sending me material that I'm able to upload. But, you know, the digital age is great with this, because nostalgia has meant that anyone who has any document is digitizing it, uploading it on Facebook, of all places. I mean, I'm on Facebook all the time because it's a research resource for me. But this also led us to the sort of, you know, trying to document, build a field, led us to create this association of modern contemporary art from the Arab world, Iran and Turkey, AMCA, which has various initiatives. For all of you who are not familiar with it, I'm gonna sort of, you know, do a sort of plug-in ad. Please become a member, because this is your way of connecting to the field. There is a Randa Saad Prize for Best Graduate Paper, Modern Contemporary Arab Art. We have the Anthem Modern Contemporary Art of the Arab World, Iran, Turkey series, where we publish specific short, small books on the biography of a work of art. Specifically, people, you know, various scholars write reviews. We host conferences, one of which was generously funded by Sultan and the Barjil Art Foundation. And we kind of participate in various other conferences like College Art Association, Majlis Study Association, which all sort of whom we are affiliates here in the US, which all sort of, led to the idea of making this field acknowledged, accessible, concrete. And that also then led to more archiving. So in the 90s, when I was doing my graduate research, in a way, I mean, there's sort of like, the positive and negative. It was when I contacted any of the artists, they gave me everything they had, because they were just so happy that someone is looking, talking to them, that they gave me material easily. I didn't really have to do a lot of digging, but also realized then, and with the sort of, the limited material that I have, there was a mainstream narrative of what is modern Arab art that is being promoted. And we've had in the, 1997, there was the Wujdan Hashimi, Wujdan Ali's book of modern Islamic art, which I, of course, have a specific ideological conflict with, but there were the exhibitions that Salwa Maqdadi hosted, and there was sort of the second narrative that people like the late Kamal Bulata, wrote, and that guided us through to some extent, but again, and very much kind of confirmed a specific mainstream narrative. But also we realized that we only have excerpts of certain text that is essential. And so hence the project of Modern Art in the Arab World Primary Documents, which had a sort of a long evolution, but in its manifestation included manifestos and the declarations by artists. We wanted to hear the voice of artists. We wanted to know what the artists are saying. And in many ways, it added new ways for us to look at this material. There are there was like sort of this mega, which is very modernist, okay? We wrote a mega narrative of what is modern Arab art, and that now it's time to unpack and write these smaller stories, the smaller narratives that in fact, they lead in the big story. They kind of, tell us then where we went wrong or not in the big story, but they allow us to know more and more details. And I'm happy to say, the students who are doing the work, I mean, Suhaila's work on Mahmoud Sabri, for example, is a good example, that this sort of small little narratives, they kind of make us understand that modernism was not an alternative or derivative modernism from European modernism, but rather we just had the story wrong. We just need to understand how European modernism was formed and how the colonies, were part of that formulation. And we are only able to know that and figure that out through looking at the little details. Now, this book is not exhaustive or exclusive, rather inclusive of everything that was being produced, but it had, because it followed a format that MoMA had as well, but it also made us find full text and translate it in an accessible way. Like for example, even now, and while we did all of this with the understanding that I wanted to use this for teaching, because like I said, me as a student is one issue, and then teaching is a whole other issue. My students just as recently asked me, what is plastic arts? Why is this text have this sort of term plastic arts? And it's something we debated, Annika Linson, Sarah Rogers, and I debated with all the consultants that we had in the book. It is the term فنون تشكيلية that the Arab used. Now, most likely it is translated from the French. فنون, we have فنون تطبيقية, فنون تشكيلية, and so then it translates into English into plastic arts. Now, I'm really not sure if it has any. I mean, it is part of modernism, the notion of the plasticity of the form, but and so it kind of applied then. But I'm not sure that it would make a big difference if we just said visual arts, to be honest, or even fine arts, as the sort of the term that was used mostly. But trying to connect these works with certain text and the story of how this moment happened, now, at least for me, it's making me relax a bit. Think, okay, now I can start to look at the small stories and say, let me look at the 1958, for example, in Iraq. What specifically, how did people engage? What were the artists doing? So it allows me to start looking at the particularities of the stories of, what formed this sort of idea when we talk about, and this book, Modern Art in the Arab World, was specific. It is about the Arab sort of, cultural overlap moment, which is at one point in time kind of, aligns itself with the political, but really not. And so when you start writing these stories, when you start finding these evidence, then you can start having debates about what do we mean by Arab art? What is Arab in the idea of Arab art? How do we look at what was happening in Iraq, or what was happening in the UAE, or what was happening in Egypt as part of this larger story? They all kind of also tell us that when we hear media celebrating the Arab Spring because the Arabs are in the street, and they're making art, we can say that, there's a history, there's a tradition. It's not something new. They didn't just start making art, but rather, there is something to fall onto. I tell you, one of the things that I start kind of, I wrote Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetic book based on the rupture with the Islamic, mostly, something that I am currently reevaluating. I think that in my sort of haste to try to prove that this is not Islamic art and we can't talk about a continuation of Islamic art, maybe I did kind of, miss certain points. And I'm going to end. I am aware of time, and I know no one is timing me, but because I would like to have a conversation with everyone, and I can elaborate in any of this, any other questions, I want to end at this note. So when we then start thinking about writing art history of the region and of the countries, we equally need to think about, what does art history mean in these places of the world? We seem, there's this sort of, popular notion, is art history global? James Elkin's sort of famous book and the various lectures he gave. Is art history global? And of course, we all want to jump and say, of course it is. We make art, artists make art, then art history is global. But the reality is, what does it mean in different parts of the world? So AMCA, in collaboration with the Getty Foundation, are about to initiate this project, which is, sort of this summer was going to be a major production of it, but clearly now a lot of things have to change as we are not able to travel around the region collecting data. But this is a call for all of you who are here to see if you can help us with collecting this data. We want to know what programs of art history exist in any of these countries, what universities, what alternative formats of art history are being formed from, we want the past and we want the contemporary as well, because there is a different change, the colonial, post-colonial, and the neo-colonial all kind of lead into different interpretation of what art history is. But we want to collect the data. We want to make it available on a website, on an interactive map, as a matter of fact, in the region, where we want to kind of, again, refute this notion, as we did. There is no modern Arab art, there is no contemporary Arab art, there is no art history in the Arab world. We want to come to a conclusion one way or the other. We also want the region to be able to say what they want. I mean, when we formed AMCA, our hope was to connect with the region, but the connection was, not as easy or as smooth as we would have liked it to be. I think digitally today, maybe we have a better choice. So I want to sort of take advantage of that. I guess, my whole professional career has been moments of me taking advantage of what politics is doing and pushing scholarship through that. We all have to be strategists at some point. But so this is a moment where we want to collect this data, make it available, so all of you researchers are able to access that. It's the same thing that we did with the MoMA sort of book. It's the same thing that, we did with the Maya website. It's making this information accessible. We seem to think that I am writing this book about this artist. Think about how many books are there about Cubism, Picasso, Braque, or Impressionism. And there are new theses, new dissertations, new graduate students who are working on this topic. For us to have 2 books on Jawad Salim is not enough. So because, again, we need to move away from the meta sort of narrative of the story of Jawad Salim and start re-evaluating all these words. Jabra Ibrahim Jabra, someone who wrote, he was a friend, he was a contemporary, and he wrote about Jawad. So we need to sort of look at that material again. And do we really see that? Does it even transfer? Is it something that still makes sense in today's age? We know more. We have other material, and we need to take full advantage of that. All right, I'm going to stop with that. Is that good, Sultan?
Perfect. Thank you so much. يعطيك ألف عافية. Actually, I want to say 2 things. First of all, I want to commend you on saying that you are revising ideas that you had and you held in previous years now as you're learning more and developing your thesis. So that is really something that I think we commend you all, and we need more examples of that. The second thing is not my point, but could you stop sharing your presentation so we can have a larger image of you? The second thing I want to say is, yeah, of course, and thank you for writing for both our books at Barjeel. We really appreciate it, both these publications. And the final thing I was going to say is that the primary documents book, the primary documents book that Nada and a team of stellar scholars worked on in the past a few years, and I think it came out 2 years ago, is now available to be downloaded for free on the MoMA website. So you go on the MoMA website under publications and you have that book. I will hand over the mic now to Melissa Gronin. Melissa Gronin is a journalist with the national newspaper here in Abu Dhabi. Melissa, you're unmuted and you're spotlighted. Go ahead.
Nada, that was great. Thank you so much. It's such a joy to hear you speak under any circumstances, even COVID. I actually, the question I wanted to ask you was something that you gestured to at the end of the talk, which is about the data points between art histories in the Arab world and art history methodologies in the US world. I mean, that's something that I think, because I don't speak Arabic, I can never get a sense of how much Arabic scholarship exists on these artists in the Arab world, but also in what ways their methodologies and the ways they think about art histories differ. And I think that was something that you were starting to say that you were collecting data points on. But that's always such a question that's laced with, histories of colonialism, having these US departments then retelling the story of Arab art histories. So I was wondering if I could get you to expand on that a little.
So, thank you, Melissa, and so good to see you. And, it's really, I'm happy to see a lot of faces, and I missed Dubai in March this year. So one of the issues is also an issue of translation. This is something that we really felt and understood, despite, so in the reality is both co-editors and a lot of the scholars in the field, particularly as you saw, all of my efforts to build this field have been mostly here in the US. And so I am very aware that this is a US-based initiative that is trying to reach beyond. And so methodologies is an issue. And I'm trained here. And everyone else is trained in these methodologies. The reality is why we're starting this mapping the art history in the Arab world, Iran, Turkey, is because when the Getty Foundation came to me and wanted to connect with art history in the Arab world, I said, I don't really know where to send you. I don't want to send you to AUB or AUC or even, NYU Abu Dhabi, because this has, this is something that already has, it's accessible and people know. that I want to know more about what is there and what is available. And so we started this project. But there is there are publications in Arabic. The problem is that, you know, mostly they were published by ministries, limited edition, given out, no ISBN numbers that we can kind of locate, although they do show up in a lot of the university libraries, on Amazon, on Facebook. So we're able to access some of these underground bookshops. There is such a thing, black market bookshops. So we find them. But then again, you know, you have to then sort of separate between the ideology, and, you know, the Ministry of Information in Iraq published a lot of books on Iraq. And so they're all sort of celebratory, but they give us details that we can take and, you know, into something else. So there's that. There is the issue of translating the text, but also understanding these nuances when you translate. For example, in 2003, when I went to Baghdad, I went with a team of scholars who were US-based scholars. And I translated a lot for them. But it kind of confirmed also something I understood. What many of the artists or many of the people that we were talking to were saying in English was not exactly what they were saying in Arabic. So there is sort of like those we're in the family and those people outside of the family, and what can we tell them and how do we tell them? Because, and I think this is also exasperated by the fact that we are always in a position of defense, because we want to define and defend our existence as equal. So we kind of think that we should always share, we'll tell them what they want to hear. And this seems to be a problem when we come to translate, because to what extent do I really trust these words that are being published here, knowing other things, for example? That's why talking to our modernists, the older artists, and recording that, oral history is important. Understanding also that, of course, memory has changed because of time, but it gives us, it's a lot of sort of detective work. And this is really what art history is all about, as you well know, is that, you're sort of looking through all this material to find possibilities of stories. And we need to know that there need to be more than one story. It's okay to have conflicting stories as well, because no one knows. Even the people who were living then, would have different memories of things. And so we need to be open to the idea that there can be more than one story. I could be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. And that's why, revisiting my theories. I mean, there is, for me, Sultan was commenting on that. When I hear people saying about any book that I'm involved in becoming a Bible, I guess the MoMA book is fine, because we went to a lot of trouble to remain neutral and not give opinion. Of course, it's really difficult not to. But in modern Arab art, of course, it's all about my opinion. And so, but I've changed my opinion about things. So now I'm always afraid of even assigning it in my classes until I finish writing this next book that I'm working on, which will revise some of them, what I had said in the first book, but also tackles the issue of methodology, which Melissa, as you were asking more, because we are very aware that the methodologies in art history that we follow are Euro-American methodologies that apply to modern art, for example, in Europe. And we're trying to translate that. And that may, that's a very tricky thing.
Doctora, thank you so much. I'm going to have to ask you to make your answers shorter, because I have so many questions. So I know this is difficult, and Joseph Mas'ad once told me that he refuses to abide by dictatorial announcements. Please make your answers shorter. There's a question here there's a suggestion from Charles Pocock, who says that there's so many PhD dissertations and MA dissertations. It would be great to have them published one day, perhaps. Of course, if the quality is good. There's a question from Antonia Carver of Jameel Art Center, who says, do you believe that there are pros and cons influence of the increase in interest in modern art? Has this impacted on the scholarship and awareness of modern art is this a good thing or a bad thing? But please, under 1 minute.
Sure. Yes. For Charlie, I mean, you know, we encourage our graduate students to publish. Work with your advisors and get your work published as soon as you can. Antonia, yes, it has impacted for the good or the bad. So, you know, while unlike Joseph Masad, I will not say that I won't abide by dictatorial. I have learned to find ways around it. So, and this is what I've done with this sort of increased interest in the contemporary, to be honest, not the modern. At first, it was the contemporary. And Antonia, you're one of the people who brought the modern into Dubai because you knew it was lacking and because the contemporary was sort of taking over with no roots. And so it gave an urgency for modernism to push scholarship. The fear is always of this sort of quick publications. You know, academic publication takes a couple of years before they come out. There's a lot of peer reviewing. And so the coffee book sort of, you know, craze that happened, great, good images, but the scholarship, you know, is kind of scary because it's not edited.
Okay, so the other person I'd like to welcome is a fellow Iraqi author who's the Dr. Ahmed Naji Saeed, who's the author of Under the Palm Trees, Modern Iraqi Art with Mohammed Makkiya and Jawad Salim. Ahmed, you're unmuted and you're spotlighted. تفضل سؤالك.
Thank you, Nada. Good to see you. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. You're such a, you know, a source of pride and inspiration for many Iraqis, including myself. I just wanted to ask you quickly. I know I have many questions as always, but I'm just going to limit it to maybe the top two. So one of the things that obviously you started this field of documenting or recreating the museum in Iraq and its archives and tracing the photographs, etc. And there has been two documents that are published by people who worked in the Ministry of Culture after 2003. One is the Red List by Salam Atta Sabri, and there was another book which was, you know, much larger in terms of its scope. But both of these have lots of questions in terms of their legitimacy, in terms of their methodology, etc. So if you could just, you know, comment on these and whether these have any value at all, or at least in the scope of art history, what are the point of these fake red lists, or maybe not so red? The other question is to do with, again, historical narratives, but from local historians inside Iraq. Have you worked, collaborated? Do you trust any of the voices that are still inside Iraq, those who are teaching in the Academy of Fine Art, in the Institute, or, for example, people who are known for their a great contribution to Iraqi art and literature, for example, like May Mudaffar? So if you could just comment on these two. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, Ahmed. Always good to see you too. And thank you for your work in, you know, helping with all of these efforts. So two things. Yeah, the Red List and the bigger book, which, by the way, I do have both. And the big book, funny story, Sultan, was actually brought to you in Sharjah, but I stole it. So, you know, if you, but yes, they are. I mean, ideologically, they were specifically the Red List. You know, was published by money from the American Embassy. Although, you know, I am, you know, very selective in how I think about dirty money. It's okay, you know, but they have problems. I mean, there's a Picasso work in the Red List listed as Jawad Salim. That is so telling of so many, you know, issues. But what they are useful in the sense that, you know, they give us another layer of cross-referencing. And this is what we do. I collect all material, try to not judge the material by its source and where it's coming from, but understand while I'm deciphering that material that I need to be aware of that. So don't accept anything as a fact, but that's what you do as a scholar. You don't accept anything as a fact. And that also kind of applies to the voices, which are really important, from the local voices, whether they are the faculty at the academy, which you know, we hope we can connect with more, or people like May Mudaffar, whose work has been incredibly important to all of us. because she not only kind of was documenting and writing from back then when she was involved in all of this, but she also has the material, and she's been very generous in sharing and documenting, and particularly the work of Rafa Nasri, documenting his whole career and making it accessible to people. So of course this is very important, but as everything else, it has to be unpacked, understood within the context it was generated, and within this sort of contemporary context, and understand how you can use it to help the scholarship, the theory. This was a very difficult thing to do with the MoMA book, because even when writing these little blurbs that introduce the text, we found ourselves sort of making or passing value judgment, and had to retract and try to present them as they were at their time, understanding that as much as we try to be objective, it's not. So I mean, in various ways, you have to cross-reference. A lot of the graduate students' work showed us dates that even the artists had them wrong. So we have to sort of sift through all of this material and figure it out.
Thank you, Doctora. Your answers are wonderfully elaborate. I would like to ask...
I will shorten them.
we have a question in Arabic now. So the question is from Munira Al-Ahmed. I'm gonna switch to Arabic for 3-4 minutes, so you guys can do a quick coffee break if you don't speak Arabic. السؤال من الأخت منيرة الأحمد، وهي باحث مستقل في مجال علم اجتماع الفن العربي. منيرة تفضلي يا أختي وسؤالك لو سمحت.
مساء الخير دكتورة. شكرا سلطان أول حاجة، ومساء الخير دكتورة ندى. I'm a big fan actually. بس أنا كنت أفضل إن أتكلم بالعربي لأن حسيت إن السؤال شوي ممكن يكون طويل، فما راح أطول. دائما التوثيق بالفنون العربية تكون من خلال الماضي، فأنا وايد أهتم بالفيوتشرست أو الفيوتشرزم فيما يتعلق بالفن العربي. فأبي أعرف هل في توثيق مثلا للحاضر الحين يساهم في إنه يحفظ الفن العربي مستقبلا؟ مثلا أنا وايد أهتم بسنة 2050 2100 مثلا، which is ممكن يكون انتهاء فن المعاصر وبداية القرن ال22. هل في سيناريوهات جاهزة ممكن الواحد يعرفها على أساس إنه إيش مستقبل الفن العربي؟ This is my question. Thank you.
شكرا لسؤالك. طبعا should I answer in Arabic or English?
بالعربي براحتك.
Okay. So I mean الواحد ما يقدر اوكي انجليزي معلش او مخلط يلا. You can't predict the future. فاحنا ما نقدر نعرف شنو السيناريوهات، ما ممكن يكون في سيناريوهات جاهزة للمستقبل. We can't have predictable scenarios for the future. But the contemporary الحالي بيوثق. الجهود اللي يعملها سلطان في البرجيل Art Foundation among many others are documenting the contemporary. So they يوثقون المعاصر اللي حاصل. All of you need to be documenting everything. One of my students just reminded me in my postmodernism class, and they had to do an exhibition, and the students decided to do an exhibition about the pandemic. But she was saying how difficult it was to find authenticated resources with the full documentation, the name of the artist and their work from even the AIDS epidemic. And so she was urging everyone who's doing work now, please document them. وثقوا أعمالكم الحالية. وإذا تعرفون فنانين قولوا لهم يوثقون أعمالهم الحالية، لأنه هذا هو المستقبل اللي حنعرف شو يصير. إنما حاليا إحنا جزء من يعني الحركة الفنية العالمية، فكيف هذا راح يكون في المستقبل ما نعرف. هل يكون في فن عربي، فن أمريكي، أو فن فضائي؟ Who knows? Yeah, this remains to be seen.
مشكورة دكتورة. أنا ما شاء الله the screen is full, so it takes me a second to find the people I want to spotlight. But I have a question from a former student of mine from Abu Dhabi, Jude Al-Marar. But because mashallah the room is full, I have to scroll through several pages, and I can't find you, Jude. But Jude was a great... There she is. I see Jude. Okay, Jude, you're unmuted and your camera's off, but you can ask your question, Jude.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't Zoom ready to be spotlighted, but my question is, I'm studying at the Arab Studies program at Georgetown, and we work a lot, we talk a lot about archiving and, the issues and the challenges and the pitfalls. And we do face these challenges when we conduct research, especially about, you know, resources from the Arab world. Another issue I'd like your point of view on is really, what do you think about all these archival documents which have been, you know, taken out of their context during the invasion, during the Arab Spring, many times illegally, and are part of Western organizations, sometimes accessible, sometimes not. You know, there is censorship involved in that. So yeah, I just wanted to know, what do you think about that topic?
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, of course, I understand all your challenges and difficulties with trying to find these archives, and we want all these archives. Like, for example, the Hoover archives, the Makia archives just went dark. Now they're not accessible anymore at Stanford, at the Hoover Institute, because apparently it has sensitive material that, you know, whatever. Could cause problems. And so this becomes another problem when there are archives and then they are hidden or they go dark, and you can't access them until, like, I don't know, maybe in 20, 30 years. So removing those archives, I mean, we have a problem of trying to explain to the Arab world that, please, you know, save the archives. But of course, the destruction level in Iraq, for example, where a lot of archives were destroyed, is one thing that shows us that, you know, if you don't have the capability of even saving or sort of preserving what you have, that's a whole other problem. I hear from scholars and colleagues who work in India of how difficult it is to access a lot of the archives there. We all know in Cairo, you can go to basements of some government buildings and there are, you know, loads and loads of archives that have not been processed. So there is this fear of archives, or this, maybe, I mean, sacredness to archives. You know, they're either, like I said, they even became part of the artwork for some of the artists. We need to kind of, you know, desensitize that. We need to make archives accessible. Archives are only as, you know, as good as the accessibility to them. If they exist and we can't see them, then they mean nothing. And so I would, you know, urge anyone who has any kind of archive to make it you know, accessible so we can see it. Now, those who, of course, disappear on us, well, you know, it becomes a political issue. Archives are always political.
Thank you so much, Doctora. Doctora, I have a question from Her Excellency Noor Al-Kaabi, the Minister of Culture and Knowledge Development here in the UAE. She just messaged it in, and she's asking, what is your dream for the art scene in the Arab world?
Oh, well, I am honored that, you know, Her Excellency is asking me a question, so thank you very much. My dream for the Arab world, art in the Arab world, is for it to feel that it is equal to any other art. I still feel that our artists, even our contemporary artists, compete not for who they are and what they are, but rather compete for a larger market that is very controlled by a small art world. So, I mean, for artists, I hope they can feel their worth, but for them to feel that, we probably need to make the modern history of our art, as well as, you know, everything else beyond the modern, an equal form of knowledge, so they can feel comfortable with it.
Thank you, Doctora. We have now the artist, the great artist, I should say, Samia Halabi. Samia, you're unmuted and you're spotlighted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Nada, first of all, what a pleasure to see you. And I am so pleased and impressed by the scientific attitude you take. I'm going to ask you a kind of philosophical questions that goes to the basics that concerns artists. And I'm going to read what I wrote, so I'd be brief. If we go back to the ABCs of art history, and I'm not talking about anybody's ABCs. There could be yours, mine, anybody's. There could be the Arab world's, what should be our ABCs. What percentage should visual analysis of the artworks themselves and the growth of the visual knowledge and formal language that is in the artworks, what percentage should that analysis be in art history itself? You know, should it be 40%, 10%, or is all the other documentation more important?
Well, I mean, you know, that is a bit of a difficult philosophical question, Samia. Oh, first, lovely to see you, of course, and thank you for being here, and for all the work that you do, because you yourself have contributed a lot to the whole documentation archiving. So, I mean, I don't know that I can think of, you know, I mean, the job of art history is to not lead, but to follow. And write the story of what the artists do and what methodologies they follow, you know, lead us to think of how we can decipher. So there is some sort of course, communication, and we all share the philosophical underpinning because of the age that we're in, and that why it changes. And so, I mean, I think they are in certain way distinct roles. And to be honest, you know, the only historians who work on the contemporary know their artists, because remember, everyone else who writes on the Renaissance or you know, the medieval or any other age, they have no artist to work with. And so the interpretation of the art of the object becomes, you know, what the artistry does. So the object becomes the focus. And I think to some extent, we should do the same, whether, you know, it's the modern or the contemporary. I mean, when I look at your work and I talk to you, it's one thing, but then I am more equipped to decipher that you're equipped to create, let's say. And so, you know, there's an overlap in percentage. I'm not sure, you know, I'm not sure I can quantify. I don't know if that answers your question, Samia. Sorry, but we can talk about this later. Yes.
Doctora, we have a question next from Lina Ramadan, who's assistant curator at Madhaf in Doha and a PhD student at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Lina, you are unmuted and spotlighted.
Thank you, Sultan, for introducing me and for organizing this wonderful talk. Nada, the richness of your work and research has informed and shaped many cultural and art practices, as well art institutions. It also influenced the way I personally look and research the collection of Madhaf, which is the Arab Museum of Modern Art. It's a unique and complex collection, and your legacy has been kind of, you know, living with us today, and we kind of keep learning from that experience. One challenge I keep encountering when dealing with topics on Arab modernity and women representation is the absence of narratives and archives that tell stories of these women. My question to you, Nada, is that what are the methodologies and steps that researchers can take to bridge this gap, and also how institutions can encourage the writing and rewriting, I stress on that word, the histories of women artists. Thank you.
Thanks, Lina, and so good to see a face with the name. And you know, I'm starting to feel very old with you know, all the praise. But what you have at Madhaf is a wealth of objects that they need to be your point of beginning. And so, and the methodologies should not be, there should not be one methodology. You know, we teach methodology courses for graduate and undergraduate students. And I always tell students, you know, don't follow one, don't say I'm going to follow a feminist or a Marxist methodology to understand this work of art. Follow whatever you need, because, you know, you shouldn't interpret the work based on a specific methodology, but you should find what methodology helps you understand the work. So for you, in the space where you are, you're able to look at these objects of art and try to start from unfolding, unpacking, understanding what the form is telling you, what the object is telling you. And then, of course, now there are many initiatives and many graduate students who are working. I know two students who are here online now who are working on women artists. And so the biographies and the encyclopedia at Madhaf that I started was specifically another form of documentation, because we wanted to write specific standardized names, because that was a whole other problem of spelling of names, but also connect with the works, with the artists and their biography, and larger and larger. It was a point of beginning. you have that material. And I do hope the encyclopedia project continues to grow, because it's sad for it to not to. But this is your point of beginning of moving forward between the object and the archival material. And we can talk about this later because I have a dictator monitoring us.
Okay, Allah يسامحك. Doctora, our final question.
Good dictator, yes.
Doctora, our final question is from Dr. Rida Momini, who is the Aga Khan Fellow at the Department of Art History at Harvard and also at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. He's now at Cambridge. Rida, please quickly, you've got 1 minute, both of you, to ask and answer a question. You are highlighted and unmuted.
Hi, Nada. It's such a pleasure to see you and listen to you. And I would like to thank also the dictator for organizing this wonderful Majlis. I will be very quick. You talk about archives, lack of publication, your initiative in the USA also. But I want to ask you, according to you, what should be done or what are the next steps for the recognition of the field of modern Arab art in US university, but also in Europe and also in the universities of the Arab world? Thank you very much, Sultan.
Rida, so nice to see you. And, Rida and many of you who asked questions are people who are doing some of the steps that need to be done. So Rida's work on Tunisia, for example, which sort of looked at not just the 19th century, but into the 20th century, creates another sort of aspect of the narrative that is required. I'm happy to say that academic, I have students who have students now in academia in the US. So I think to some extent, we are on the right track of establishing an acknowledged form. I mean, I just got elected to the board of CAA, College Art Association. So, art academia in the US acknowledges the art of art. We had MoMA publish our book, so we're doing fine. I think Europe is still lagging, to be honest, and then a lot of it has to do with funding and with resources. And more importantly, we need to figure out how to connect with the region. And many of you who are in the region are already doing that. We just need to sort of try to make a better and wider sort of web of connection, so we can kind of not work in isolation. So whatever we're doing here in the US is impacted by you as well as it impacts you in the region. We need to have this collaboration. We need to do more. All of us need to do more. We should not be afraid of my last words. We should not be afraid of archives. We should not be afraid of being wrong or saying a wrong thing, or saying that Nada said the wrong thing, because here's the new material that I found and this is what she said and now I know better. These things do happen. Scholarship needs to grow. It cannot be limited one story, one thing. That and so with that we can all kind of help the field grow. Thank you.
Doctor, I think this is the very first talk that I take no questions from the comments, and the comments are full of questions and I think full of praise for you. If there's one thing I would like is to have a way to clone you and have 200 or 300 Nada Shabouts, because we need 1 or 2 in every city in the Arab world and beyond. Thank you so much, Doctora, for taking the time. I know it was early in the US there. Thank you so much for everything you do, really endlessly. Thank you endlessly, Doctora. You are such a great champion of art from the region. I mean, really, there are no words to express how much we all adore you. I think that's the smallest word we can use, is how much we adore you. And again, we had 240 people sign up, and that's a testament to how popular you are and how loved you are. We hope we all see you soon, Doctora. Thank you so much. I'll be sending you the chat questions so that you can follow up with people. And we're also recording this talk. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Doctora. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sultan, very much. And thank you, everyone. And yes, we can continue this conversation via email. Bye-bye.